Evangeline stood alone before the towering portrait in the great hall, a vast space that had never once felt like home. The painted eyes of the late Duchess of Hartmore gazed down with a serene, knowing smile, her golden hair catching eternal candlelight. Somewhere behind her, the heavy oak door closed with a soft, final click. That sound had become the echo of her marriage. 6 months had passed since Evangeline Harcourt became the new Duchess, and still her husband looked past her as though she were made of glass. That evening she had dressed with trembling hope, choosing a gown of pale rose, her maid threading pearls through her dark hair. At dinner, the Duke of Hartmore sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, a newspaper unfolded beside his plate, his gray eyes skimming words that were not hers. He did not speak. He did not glance up. The only voice in the room was the whisper of his knife against porcelain. Evangeline had eaten in silence, the food tasteless on her tongue. Now, standing beneath the portrait of the woman he had loved and lost, she felt the slow, cold erosion of her soul. She was not a wife. She was a placeholder, a transaction to settle her father's debts and secure an heir the Duke clearly had no intention of creating. From a shadowed corridor, small footsteps approached and halted. She turned to find Edmund, the Duke's 8-year-old son, watching her with the same gray eyes as his father. The boy's expression was hard, far too old for his years. "You should not stand there," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "That is my mother's painting. Father does not like anyone too close." Evangeline's heart squeezed. She managed a soft smile. "I was only admiring her beauty. She was very lovely." "She was perfect," Edmund stated, his chin lifting with defiant pride. "And you are not her." He spun on his heel and disappeared into the gloom of the hallway, leaving Evangeline with a sting that no polite company had ever prepared her to endure. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, began to tremble. She pressed her lips together until they hurt, then walked slowly up the grand staircase to her empty bedchamber, where the fire had long since burned to ash. That night she lay awake staring at the canopy, listening to the wind moan around Hartmore Hall. She had arrived with such fragile hope. She had believed that kindness, patience, and gentle devotion could slowly warm even the coldest heart. She had imagined shared meals softening into conversation, quiet walks through the gardens, a hand finally reaching for hers across the darkness. Instead, she had received nothing but courtesy so distant it felt like contempt. The next morning she resolved to try again. She woke early, dressed in a simple blue morning gown, and went down to the breakfast room before the Duke appeared. She arranged a plate of fresh bread and fruit at his place, poured his tea herself, and waited with a hopeful tightness in her chest. When Lucien Devereux, the Duke of Hartmore, entered the room, he paused at the threshold. For one fleeting second his gaze landed on her, and something unreadable flickered there. Then his face smoothed back into that familiar mask of marble composure. "You need not trouble yourself, Your Grace," he said, his tone as flat as still water. "The staff are perfectly capable." "I wish to do it," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I thought we might take breakfast together." He sat down, lifted his teacup, and drank without meeting her eyes. "I have pressing business this morning. The estate accounts require attention." And just like that she was dismissed. Not unkindly, not cruelly, simply extinguished. She remained seated as he finished his meal in silence, the only sound the scrape of butter on toast and the distant clatter of servants in the hall. When he rose and left without a backward glance, Evangeline's hands curled into her lap and the tiny flame of hope she had nurtured began to gutter. Days bled into weeks. She walked the corridors of Hartmore like a quiet specter, learning its rhythms while remaining forever outside them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, was efficient but cool, her loyalty clearly anchored to the late Duchess's memory. The maids curtsied, but their eyes held a pity Evangeline could not bear. One afternoon, passing the linen closet, she overheard two of them whispering. "The master will never love another. Everyone knows that. Lady Catherine was the light of this house. This new one, she's just a duty, a legal necessity. Evangeline pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. The words sliced into her heart with surgical precision. She stood there until the maid's footsteps faded, then walked slowly to the library, where she locked the door and let silent tears fall onto the pages of a book she could not see. That evening at dinner, she did not dress with hope. She wore a simple gray gown, her hair pulled back without adornment. The Duke did not notice. He spoke briefly about the tenant farmers and an upcoming visit from a neighboring baronet, then retreated to his study. Evangeline finished her soup alone, staring at the empty chair across from her, and something inside her began to shift. The next morning she did not go to the breakfast room. Instead, she wrapped herself in a warm cloak and walked out across the frost-kissed grounds, her boots leaving prints in the silver grass. She found the neglected corner of the estate where an old rose garden had once flourished. Weeds choked the pathways. Dead vines clung to rusted trellises. Clearly, it had been abandoned long before her arrival. Something about its forgotten beauty called to her. She knelt in the cold earth, pulled on an old pair of gardening gloves she found in a shed, and began to dig. Day after day, Evangeline returned to that secret garden. She cleared brambles, turned the soil, and coaxed life from dormant roots. She visited the village and purchased seeds with her small personal allowance. The work made her hands ache and her back sore, but it gave her something she had not felt since arriving at Hartmoor: purpose. The old gardener, a grizzled man named Mr. Hobbs, watched her with initial suspicion, but soon began offering quiet advice. The estate steward, a young man named John Hale, noticed her efforts and offered to procure rare rose cuttings from a nursery in Bath. She accepted with a grateful smile. Word spread among the tenants that the new Duchess spent her afternoons with dirt under her fingernails. They saw her walking the lanes, visiting cottages, asking about children and harvests. She began teaching a small group of village girls to read in the parsonage twice a week. She listened to the elderly widow Pemberton stories for hours, holding her gnarled hand. Slowly, the people of Hartmoor began to speak of her with warmth. The whispers changed. The Duke, however, remained oblivious. He was frequently absent on business, or locked in his study, or riding the boundaries of the estate. When they did cross paths, he offered the same hollow politeness. She no longer sought his attention. She no longer dressed for him or waited at the window for his return. Her heart had not stopped caring, but she had learned to seal it away behind a wall of quiet dignity. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evangeline was in the garden when John Hale arrived with a basket of young rose plants. His face was open and kind, his brown eyes holding none of the chilly reserve of the household staff. He knelt beside her in the dirt and helped her plant them, their laughter carrying on the breeze as they worked side by side. "You have transformed this place, Your Grace," he said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "It was a dead thing, and now it breathes again." Evangeline smiled, the first true smile to touch her lips in many months. Gardens are forgiving. They ask only for patience and care, and they give everything in return. "Not unlike people, I suppose," John said quietly, and something in his tone made her cheeks flush. She looked away quickly and did not see the figure standing motionless on the gravel path behind the yew hedge. The Duke of Hartmoor had returned early from a meeting, and finding the hall empty, had walked the grounds in search of his wife. He now stood frozen, watching Evangeline laugh with his steward, seeing a lightness in her expression he had never once witnessed directed at him. Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in his chest. He turned on his heel and strode back to the house, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. He did not understand the feeling. He did not want to name it. That evening, Evangeline appeared at dinner with a smudge of dirt still on her wrist. The Duke was already seated, his face carved from stone. "I trust your afternoon was productive," he said, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard before. She paused, unsettled. "It was, thank you. I've been working in the old rose garden." "With Mr. Hale?" It was not a question. The air between them thickened. Evangeline met his gaze squarely. He was kind enough to assist with some plantings. I am sure he was. The Duke set down his fork with a quiet clink. Perhaps you forget that you are the Duchess of Hartmore. It is unseemly for you to be digging in the mud with the steward. Evangeline felt heat rise to her cheeks, but her voice remained calm. I forget nothing, Your Grace. I am reminded every day exactly what I am in this house. I choose to spend my time where it might actually be of use. He stared at her, something flickering behind the gray. For a breath she thought he might argue, but he only rose and left the room, leaving her alone with the candles and the silence. The tension between them stretched into the following weeks, a taut wire neither would pluck. The annual harvest celebration arrived, a night when the village and the great house mingled in the decorated barn with music and lantern light. Evangeline wore a gown of deep green velvet, her hair dressed with modest care. She did not expect the Duke to accompany her. He rarely attended such gatherings. She found herself drawn into the warmth of the festivities. The tenants greeted her with genuine affection. Children she had taught curtsied and tugged at her skirts. Even the vicar, a gentle old man, beamed at her. And then Sir William Trent appeared. Sir William was a handsome baronet from a neighboring estate, possessed of an easy smile and a charm that bordered on improper. He bowed low over Evangeline's hand, his lips brushing just above her glove. Your Grace, the rumors of your beauty were an understatement. Hartmore has been keeping a treasure hidden. She laughed lightly, a sound the Duke, who had arrived late and now stood half-concealed by a wooden pillar, had never heard from her before. He watched as Sir William led Evangeline onto the dance floor. Her movements were graceful, her face flushed with pleasure. The baronet's hand rested just a moment too long at her waist. The Duke's vision narrowed. A dark, possessive fury he had no right to feel rose up in his throat like bile. When the dance ended and Evangeline stepped aside, breathless and smiling, Lucien intercepted her. His hand closed around her elbow, gentle but insistent. "We are leaving," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She looked up at him, startled. "But the evening has only just." "Now." He guided her out of the barn into the cold night air. Their carriage ride back to the hall was steeped in a silence that crackled like lightning waiting to strike. Evangeline sat rigid, her heart pounding with confusion and a strange, fluttering hope she dared not name. Once inside the hall, she turned to face him. "Why did you do that? I was causing no harm." "No harm." His voice was low and rough. "You danced with a man who looked at you as though you were already his. Do you think I did not see? You have never cared how anyone looked at me before." Her words were quiet but sharp as glass. "You have looked past me since our wedding day. You have left me in this cold house with only your silence for company. I have been invisible to you, Lucien, so do not pretend to see me now." The name hung in the air between them. She had never called him that before. He stepped closer, his face half-shadowed, half-lit by the dying fire. "You are my wife." "Am I?" Her eyes glistened, but she did not weep. "I am a signature on a contract. I am a duty fulfilled. You have made that abundantly clear. I stopped hopping for more months ago. And do you know what I found? Peace. I found peace in letting go of a love you were never willing to give." Something cracked behind his gray eyes. His hand lifted as if to touch her cheek, then fell. He said nothing. He could not find the words. So Evangeline turned and walked up the stairs alone, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous silence. That night the Duke sat in his study, staring at a portrait of his first wife that hung above the mantel, Catherine. Her name used to be a prayer on his lips. She had been the sun, the music, the very heartbeat of Hartmore. And then she had died and he had entombed himself with her memory. But lately, when he thought of her face, it had begun to blur. And another face had begun to replace it. A face with gentle eyes and dirt-smudged cheeks. A face that no longer looked at him with longing. Fear crept into his heart. A slow, cold terror that he had destroyed the only thing that might have saved him. Days later, a crisis descended upon the hall. Young Edmund fell gravely ill. A fever swept through him like wildfire, turning his skin pale and his breath shallow. The Duke was summoned from a meeting in London, but the journey took hours. Evangeline did not wait. She moved into the nursery and refused to leave. For 3 days and 3 nights she sat at Edmund's bedside, sponging his burning forehead, whispering soothing words, holding his small hand even when he thrashed in delirium. The housekeeper tried to relieve her. She refused. The Duke's own physician shook his head with grim uncertainty. Still, Evangeline stayed. She sang lullabies her own mother had sung to her, her voice raw and thin. She prayed. She wept when no one was watching. On the third night, as the fever finally began to break, Edmund's glassy eyes fluttered open. He looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. "Mama," he whispered, his voice a cracked thread. Evangeline's heart stopped. She leaned closer, her hand stroking his damp hair. "I'm here, sweet boy, I'm right here." He sighed and slipped into a healing sleep. She stayed, her head resting on the edge of the bed until gray dawn crept through the curtains. The Duke arrived just after sunrise, still wearing his travel cloak, his face haggard with fear. He stopped at the nursery door, frozen by the sight before him. Evangeline, pale and exhausted, slumped in a chair with Edmund's fingers tangled in hers. The boy's color had returned. His breathing was even. Lucien crossed the room slowly. He touched Evangeline's shoulder. She stirred and looked up at him with shadowed eyes. "He called for you," she whispered. "He called me Mama." The Duke's throat tightened so fiercely he could not speak. He knelt beside her chair, and for the first time since their wedding day, he took her hand. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a rasp. "You saved him." "I love him," she said simply, and those 3 words shattered something inside him. In the days that followed, the house transformed. Edmund recovered swiftly and sought Evangeline's company at every turn. He brought her books, asked her to sit with him at meals, and once, while walking in the garden, slipped his small hand into hers. The Duke observed these changes with a mixture of gratitude and aching sorrow. He had pushed this woman away, and yet she had poured love into the cracks of his shattered family. What had he given her in return? Nothing but frost. One afternoon he found himself drawn to the rose garden. The autumn blooms were glorious now, deep crimson and soft apricot and snowy white, climbing trellises and spilling over pathways. He saw Evangeline kneeling by a rose bush, her fingers gently cupping a blossom. She did not hear him approach. He cleared his throat. She looked up, her expression guarded. "The garden," he said awkwardly, gesturing around them. "You have created something beautiful here." She rose, brushing soil from her apron. "It gave me something to love when I had nothing else." Her words landed like a blow. He took a step closer, his heart hammering. "Evangeline, I need to ask your forgiveness." She stilled, her eyes widening. "I know I have no right," he continued, his voice rough and unsteady. "I kept you at a distance. I treated you as a stranger in your own home. I was cold, I was blind, and you gave everything anyway, to Edmund, to the tenants, to these roses that bloom because you refused to let them die." He drew a shaking breath. "I have been a coward. I have been protecting a ghost at the expense of the living." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "I want to show you something." They walked together to a stone bench beneath an arbor of white roses. He opened the journal to a page marked by a faded ribbon. Inside was a letter, written in a sloping, elegant hand. He placed it in her hands. "Read it," he said quietly. "It is the last letter Catherine ever wrote." Evangeline read. The words swam before her eyes. The late Duchess confessed a secret that made her heart twist. Catherine had loved another man before her marriage. She had entered the union with Lucien out of duty, and though she had tried, her heart had never fully been his. Even worse, there was a suggestion, a terrible possibility, that Edmund was not the Duke's son. Catherine asked forgiveness for the deception, and she begged Lucien to care for the boy regardless. The letter shook in Evangeline's fingers. She looked up at him and saw the raw, unguarded pain in his face. I kept the secret to protect Edmund, Lucian said, his voice frayed. I loved him from the moment he was born. He is mine in every way that matters, but the betrayal, it buried itself in my chest like shrapnel. I swore I would never be vulnerable again. I built walls so high that even I could not see over them. And then you came, and I was so terrified of being hurt again that I refused to let you in. I punished you for her sins. Tears slipped down Evangeline's cheeks. All this time, I thought you were grieving a great love. I thought I could never compare. I thought you wished I had died instead. He flinched as though she had struck him. No, no, never that. I was a fool. A frozen, foolish man who did not realize what he had until he almost lost it. He reached out and took her hands, holding them tightly. I saw you dancing with Sir William, and I felt something I have not felt in years: jealousy, fear, the terror of losing you. And when Edmund fell ill, when I watched you fight for his life with every breath, I saw clearly what I should have seen from the first day. You are the heart of this house now. You are my wife. And I— His voice broke and he sank to one knee before her on the gravel path, heedless of the dirt. I love you, Evangeline. I love you too late, but I love you with everything I have left. She stared down at him, her tears falling freely. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the silent nights of hopping, they rose up and then, slowly, began to dissolve in the warmth of his words. She knelt too, so they were eye to eye, and cupped his face in her soil-stained hands. "It is not too late," she whispered. "I have loved you since I was 15 years old." He blinked, confusion breaking through the emotion. "What?" A small, trembling smile touched her lips. "Before you were Duke, before Catherine, before any of this, your family visited my father's estate. I was a girl, too bold for my own good. I wandered too close to a stallion and it bolted. You pulled me out of its path. You spoke to me so gently and you gave me a wildflower, a little purple vetch. I pressed it in my prayer book. I have kept it ever since." She reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small wooden keepsake box she had carried with her always. Inside lay the dried remnants of a vetch flower and a faded sketch she had drawn of a young man with gray eyes. She placed it in his palm. Lucian stared at the memento, his hands beginning to shake. "That was you," he breathed. "The girl with the braids. I never knew your name. I thought of you often, but I never knew. I agreed to this marriage not only to settle my family's debts, but because I recognized your name. I loved you from a single moment of kindness. I have loved you through every cold word, every empty silence. I had given up hope that you would ever see me, but I never stopped loving you." The Duke closed his eyes, and a single tear traced down his cheek. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. She felt his body tremble against hers, felt the years of frozen grief finally begin to thaw. They stayed there, kneeling among the roses, until the sun began to sink and the air grew cool. The weeks that followed were not without their challenges. Healing was not an instant spell. It was a slow, tender process. But the walls of Hartmore Hall began to breathe again. The Duke stopped retreating to his study after dinner. He walked with Evangeline through the gardens every morning. He asked her opinion on estate matters and listened with genuine respect. He sat with Edmund in the nursery and told the boy, with careful words, that Evangeline was not a replacement for his mother but a new gift, one they were both lucky to have. Edmund, still young enough to adapt, wrapped his arms around Evangeline's waist one evening and declared, "I'm glad you're my mama now." She held him and wept with quiet joy. Sir William Trent called once, but the Duke met him at the door with a cool civility that brooked no warmth. Evangeline did not see the baronet again, nor did she wish to. John Hale remained a loyal steward, and at the Christmas feast he raised a toast to the Duchess, calling her the true bloom of Hartmore. The entire hall erupted in cheers, and Evangeline's cheeks turned pink as the Duke's hand found hers beneath the table. One evening, as winter melted into an early spring, the Duke led Evangeline to the rose garden. New buds were already forming, fat with promise. He stopped beneath the white rose arbor, where months earlier he had knelt in anguish. Now he turned to her with a quiet smile that transformed his stern features into something tender. "You gave me a second chance I did not deserve," he said. "You taught me that love is not a memory to be guarded, but a garden to be tended. I am done living in the past, Evangeline. I want to build a future with you, a real one, full of noise and laughter and maybe, one day, more children to chase through these halls." She laughed, a free, unburdened sound that filled the garden. "I think I would like that very much." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I love you," he said, the words no longer a desperate confession but a steady, certain promise. "Not too late, just in time." She rose on her toes and kissed him softly, a kiss that tasted of earth and roses and the sweetness of long-awaited hope. The wind stirred the blossoms, and somewhere in the house, Edmund's laughter rang out. Hartmore Hall was no longer a mausoleum of memory. It was a home, alive at last. And in the garden, beneath a canopy of stars, a man who had been frozen in grief and a woman who had nearly given up on love held each other and began to write a new story, one bloom at a time.